Good evening. Welcome to the UFM Lou Douglas Lecture this evening. I'm Linda Tiener, the Executive Director at UFM Community Learning Center. UFM is the sponsor of this lecture series. Our lecture is named for Lou Douglas, who was a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University from 1949 to 1977. He was widely known for his power to inspire students, faculty, and citizens in general to instigate change and to motivate grassroots efforts and organizations to participate in what was happening in social justice, politics, economics, and foreign policy. Following the lecture, there'll be a question and answer period. We ask that you come to the microphones in order to ask your question because this is being recorded, and we'd like everybody to be able to hear that as well as those who might be listening online. If you need to leave at the end of the lecture before the question and answer, please do so very quietly so others are not disrupted in the process. Our speaker tonight is John Hofmeister, who's a graduate of Kansas State University in political science, and he happened to be a student of Lou Douglas's, which makes it very special to have him here tonight. Mr. Hofmeister is the founder and executive of Citizens for Affordable Energy, which is based in Washington, D.C., and he's the former president of Shell Oil Corporation. As Shell president, Mr. Hofmeister launched an extensive outreach program to discuss critical global energy issues. The program included an 18-month, 50-city engagement program where he and 250 other Shell executives visited with more than 15,000 businesses, civic leaders, policymakers, and academics to discuss what needed to be done to make energy available and affordable for everyone. His work in the oil industry and his interaction with elected officials and government agencies has really given John an interesting perspective on national leadership, particularly as it regards energy policy. He outlines those issues in his book, which is available for sale following the lecture. His book is entitled Why We Hate the Oil Companies, and I think he'll give you a taste of why that might be as part of his lecture tonight. So please stop and take a look at the books, and John will be available to sign your book for you after the lecture. John is a business leader who's participated in many large businesses in the last 35 years. He's held executive leadership posts at General Electric, Nortel, and Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell. He earned his bachelor's degree and master's degree in political science from Kansas State University. And in May 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Houston. Upon retirement from the oil corporation, Mr. Hofmeister founded and heads the nonprofit organization which holds a nationwide membership called Citizens for Affordable Energy. He's very passionate about making energy available for all and thinking long-term about energy solutions for our country. He's going to be talking tonight about leadership, and I'm sure he will allude to that in one way or another because as the brief time I've had talking with him, I don't think he's had 5 minutes to not talk about energy as it relates to that in some fashion. So please help me welcome Mr. John Hofmeister.
Thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think the best way to start talking about leadership tonight is to take credit for the leadership on the court last night. That was something to behold, and for me personally, and you might say, where have you been? It was my first game in 40 years. First time live present with basketball players in 40 years. You're saying, what kind of life have you led? But I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be back on the Kansas State campus, delighted to be a part of the Lou Douglas lecture series. Lou Douglas was one of the giants in my life. During the Watergate hearings, you could find Lou in his office listening to the hearings as they occurred. Lou was, if anything, a master of knowledge and awareness on American presidents. He'd met many, he'd critiqued many, And there was this little twitch of a smile seeing the likes of Richard Nixon in deep trouble. Because he predicted it would always be thus, that he was not to be trusted as a senior leader of this nation, because he knew Dick when, and he didn't like what he saw. He respected him as president, but he disagreed with much of the president's policies in those days. If you think back to the 1970s, think through the 1980s, think through the 1990s, give great credit to the leadership of this nation and how it progressed through troubled times and how it brought the country at the beginning of the 21st century to a period in which employment was full, the economy was robust, the government was in surplus, and U.S. leadership was respected around the world. It was a hard journey, but I give credit, having been a part of that 30-year journey from having graduated in '73 to having arrived at a senior leadership role by 2000, and to have been a participant in that, I always attributed to the incredible leadership education which I had received beginning at Kansas State and then continuing through a corporate career and being part of experiences at Harvard, at University of Michigan, at many other universities across the country, Stanford and elsewhere, where learning leadership was something that you did because it made a difference. And the lessons learned, the case studies studied, the experiments tried, the assessment and the development and the practicing of leadership skills was part and parcel of what leaders did. We hit the year 2000. The dot-com bubble popped. 9/11 came along, thousands of innocent Americans slaughtered, from which we have yet to recover a decade on. We looked at the security of the nation, and we have now the largest security apparatus, bar none, of any country on earth. Between the Defense Department, the Homeland Security Department, NSA, CIA, and all of the attendant security forces associated at federal, state, and local levels, we are armed to the teeth across the nation. Our business community collapsed in 2008. And those who led the collapse, those who created the collapse, multimillionaires from our financial institutions, are frankly living the good life. They made their money. They were not held accountable. Meanwhile, we have seen 3,000 plus of our beloved children, sons and daughters, brought home in a box from Iraq. Several thousand more brought home in a box from Afghanistan, the longest war in the nation's history. We've seen unemployment, structurally, seriously high unemployment in this country, reaching 10% at the height of the financial meltdown. And we have seen chronic structural unemployment in the African American young men community exceeding 50%. In my work with the National Urban League, where I have the pleasure and privilege of being the trustee, or the chairman of the trustee board, Mark Morial, our CEO, is on MSNBC, CNBC, every jobless report to remind the nation that at 10%, 9%, 8% unemployment is unacceptable. And then to also say, and in the community we serve, we exceed 50%. So what are half of those young men to do with their creativity, their genius, their sense of responsibility, their determination to have purpose, and their ability to work. But bang on unanswering doors. Sometimes, in frustration, get in trouble. We don't seem to see an end to this chronic structural high unemployment because the economy is struggling to get to 2% growth on a sustained basis, coming out of the 1990s where 5% growth was more the norm, where every industry, from information management to energy to retail to all forms of technology, where hiring, it was robust. And so you have to ask the question, how are we doing so far in the 21st century? And I would submit we're in a hole and digging deeper. We can't resolve among us in democratic discourse what policy we can agree upon on anything of substance. We're struggling to implement legacy legislation from the first term of the Obama administration called the ACA, the American Care Act, called Obamacare. It's a debacle. Supported only by one party, penalized, punished, and massacred verbally by the other party, bungled in terms of the executive leadership and management of the rollout, which is a completely unaccountable exercise, which causes real people to suffer, with prospects of who knows what, because the latest waiver was just issued this weekend. So let's waive the requirement of small business. We've already waived the requirement of big business. And we have the Republicans saying, well, let's waive the requirement of individuals, which is basically, let's dismantle what we've done because it's not ready. It's not understood. And for bureaucrats in this kind of situation to make life and death decisions on what is or what is not covered, and then turn around and read the paper from late last week, and here's the CEO of AOL making a complete ass out of himself by blaming his employees for the costs of premature newborns, which he considered unacceptable in the scheme of things, and as a consequence, partly decided to change their 401k savings programs to make the company contribution only effective once a year at year end. So the people only got a one-time payment, and if they left before December, they got zero for that year. Save costs on the backs of the employees. What a good motivator for AOL. He's toast. He's done. His credibility is shot, as is the credibility of numerous, almost countless financial executives who oversaw the meltdown while they paid themselves quite handsomely. Okay, some took a pay cut from 10 million or from 20 million to 10 million. I guess most of us could get by on that 10 million. But did anyone go to jail for the fraudulent financial leadership that these companies provided by selling financial instruments that were known to be junk with a AAA rating, knowing that people in their organization were shorting the financial instrument in order to make money on the downside, even while they were attempting to make money on the upside, playing both sides against the middle? How credible, how ethical, how sustainable is that? What I'm describing, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion, not just in this country, but around the world. Because if you look at the chaos in the Middle East and the leadership of the Middle East, if you look at the chaos in the Ukraine, and you look at the power play of Vladimir Putin versus the EU, and if you look or try to live under the environmental conditions of China this winter, wait till summer. You can't breathe the air. The U.S. Embassy records the particulate pollution every day in Beijing. And numerous days so far this winter and numerous days last summer, the particulate pollution was not 1 times, 2 times, 5 times, 10 times World Health Organization limits, but 60 times World Health Organization limits. How'd you like to breathe that 24/7? But we can't wear a golden badge of glory on air pollution, water pollution, land pollution. We have parts of this country where you cannot live because it's unsafe. We saw the water debacle in West Virginia, in the capital of West Virginia, a few weeks ago. And we know that air quality across much of the densely populated nation does not meet EPA attainment quality standards. And restrictions are placed on development because the air attainment quality standard is above the norm. I live in one in Houston, Texas, where development is restrained because the air pollution cannot be accommodated according to the standards set by the Environmental Protection Agency. We don't have so many particulates in the air that we can't see the end of the street, as is the case in Beijing, but young children suffering from asthma feel the same effects as if it were that much pollution. So from the 1990s, where we patted ourselves on the back for the quality of leadership in government to create a surplus and to accommodate Republican points of view, and who doesn't love Bill Clinton? Newt Gingrich loves Bill Clinton. Barbara Bush loves Bill Clinton because he respected all comers, respected all parties. And now we sit in the midst of partisan behavior that I simply call perverse. Because it's not just representing a different point of view. It's attacking the other side at the basic level of respect. How could you possibly respect if you're Harry Reid and he said this to my face? How could you possibly respect the Republican House when the Republican House is doing everything possible? He said this to me in 2012, early 2012. How could you possibly respect the Republican House and the bill that they're proposing on energy reform for alternative fuels when they are doing everything possible and publicly stating they're doing everything possible to make sure that Barack Obama is a one-term president? That's perverse partisan behavior. Not to take up a bill because the Republican House wants to see Barack Obama. I said to Senator Reid, when has the Republican Party ever wanted to see a Democratic second term? It does not compute. They exist to replace a Democratic president in every way possible. So why punish them for it? That's their job. He said, well, that's how you see it. I don't see it that way. And so we have the perversity of partisanship where both sides attack the basic principles, where the progressive left refers to the Republicans as, at best, zany. Zany is not a complimentary term when applied to a politician. It means they're not making sense. And so we go back and forth and back and forth. And what's happening? Nothing's happening. So when we are members of a society and we have moved from the 20th century to the 21st century with problems this serious, what's so different about the 21st century that we can't come to grips with it? All that's happened is the calendar has turned, right? Wrong. I submit that the problems we're having is because we were well equipped to deal with the issues of the 20th century, but we woefully, totally underestimated the issues of the 21st century, which have hit us smack dab in the face, unprepared, unexpectedly, and we frankly don't know what to do. We don't know what to do as a society. Our leaders don't know what to do. And we're suffering from the incompetent or ignorant or unconcerned tools of leadership in the 21st century which haven't evolved. We're still trying to use 20th century technique to solve 21st century challenges, and the tools don't work because our leaders are ill-equipped. A society reflects its leaders. Our leaders aren't talking to each other, or our leaders are corrupt, or our leaders are unengaged, or our leaders just simply don't know what to do. Why else would we be in this rut that we're in, mired in the muck of indecisive leadership in terms of where we go? I visited with very highly regarded senior executives at Saudi Aramco in Dammam, Saudi Arabia last summer. And there were two insightful questions I was asked at the dinner table. And the first question was, is your president as lazy as we think he is? He came to Cairo and gave this speech, having just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And we were really respectful of his speech and thought it was a courageous speech. Where's he been since the speech? He's invisible to us. He set a platform and set a set of objectives and told us the way the world should work, then he disappeared. And then he did this thing in Syria where he set a red line, and suddenly the red line disappeared. And you got people killing each other in Syria. And the second question was, do you think George W. Bush had a clue, or anyone in NATO had a clue, what the implications were by invading Iraq with respect to Pandora's box of Sunni-Shia relationships coming unglued and releasing into the Middle East 1,000 years of hostility at a time of maximum armaments in the population, having created this aspiration of democracy in tribal societies that don't have a clue what democracy is. And suddenly we've got the democratization of Iraq based on what? A population uneducated, a population governed the last 50 years since colonialism by a monarch followed by a tyrant. Well, that's a good start for democracy. You blow away the tyrant and you leave us in chaos. We don't have the institutions, we don't have the education, we don't have the awareness of the knowledge, and you have unleashed recrimination and all kinds of other hate and evil and death on this Middle Eastern population, depending whether you're a Sunni looking out for Sunnis or a Shia looking out for Shias. Who's going to put it back in the box? Did Bush have any idea? And so you have this situation of the 21st century being so different than the 20th century because it's in your face, it's here and now. So some of the differences. One of the differences between the 20th century and the 21st century is the definition of time. Time is of the instant. We are witness to the events of history in the instant. We can see it, we can Google it, it's happening, we're inundated with the information. Leaders in leadership positions have to respond and react in the instant. Because if you hesitate, you've lost it. So what's the instant reaction? Sometimes it's not so wise. Sometimes it's we don't understand the context. But it's happening so quickly. But at the same time it's happening quickly, leaders of organizations today are working on 2040 and beyond because they're obligated to. I had dinner last night with President Schultz. And what we talked about was K-State post-2040 and the architectural foundations of what decisions are being made today which impact the students and the role of Kansas State in society post-2040. Because if you don't start now, you won't be ready when it comes. So you have the instantaneous requirements of here and now, and you have the long-term requirements of then and later, but they happen at the same time. So time is different. What else is different? Intergenerational sustainability was not something we talked about in the 1990s. Intergenerational sustainability means we live today in anticipation of what our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will experience when they come of age with respect to air, water, and the biosphere, the land of the earth, in 2040. Apply that principle to Kansas agriculture. Kansas agriculture feeds millions and millions of people beyond the borders of Kansas. Kansas agriculture is predicated on industrial production of grain, industrial production of other edibles, including beef, including dairy, and Kansas agriculture has been world-leading. People don't suffer or starve in the Punjab because of dryland wheat. And that was my generation, dryland wheat, coming from Kansas State University. And all over the world, Kansas agriculture has had an impact on the quality of life. What in 2040 will be the sustainability of Kansas agriculture as it is today, with the prolific use of pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers, with the draining of the Ogallala Aquifer to grow crops where nature really hasn't cooperated in growing crops, but fossil water has. And can we sustain 3,000 head dairy herds? Can we sustain multi-thousand head feedlots? Can we sustain the meat production? So this is intergenerational sustainability is such a big deal because we're all educated in what we need to do to preserve and protect the earth for future generations. Governance is different. Governance is a boring word, but governance determines who decides what, when, where, how, and who. Who decides what, when, where, and how. Big deals. What is the governance? How's your state legislature doing? Governing the state of Kansas. How's our federal legislature doing at 12% approval level? 12% approval level. How's it doing? This is the governance that we rely upon for the future. How many officials are in office today that you just wonder, how did they ever get there? I live in Houston, Texas. The mayor of Houston, Anise Parker, she's, to my opinion, a fine mayor. She was elected in Houston, Texas, with 7% of the eligible voters. Her opponent got just under 7%. She's governing a multi-million person urban area where essentially 93% of the people either voted against her or didn't vote. How's that for a mandate? That's because people aren't voting in large measure. Is that because they're satisfied or happy or they're disengaged? This is what I would call democracy in name only. And Houston, Texas is not the only part of this country that has a democracy in name only problem. In the transformational presidential election of the national election cycle of 2008, what percentage of Americans voted? Slightly over half. Slightly over half. And that was a major turnout improvement from prior elections. If we live with democracy in name only in the governance model that we have embraced, representative democracy, we're going to be choosing representatives we don't know, we don't agree with, who frighten us, who either on the right or the left become extreme, because in the primary system in which we choose who will run in the general election, the activists show up. Activists on the left, activists on the right, that's their right. Can't take that away from them. But if nobody else shows up, you get what you get. And what's that going to do for us in a governance sense in the 21st century? Security is another aspect of the 21st century that is so very different. Security is everywhere. How many of you, and you don't have to raise your hand, it's a rhetorical question, how many of you have had to take your shoes off just to fly on an airplane? Is that ludicrous or what? The absurdity. take your shoes off to fly on an airplane. Perpetrated by fear and bureaucratic rulemaking. Is that really going to keep us safe? Take your shoes off? But everybody does it, unless you're pre. Be pre. I'm pre. Pre means pre-TSA. I don't know if you have it at KCI or locally at Manhattan, but you don't have to take your shoes off. Cost $100. Keep your shoes on. Complexity. Is anything getting simpler? Or is the 21st century deepening and broadening the complexity with which we have to contend with the issues of life? With a slow-growing economy, with structurally higher unemployment, with disadvantages in different parts of the population, different regions of the country, with energy systems becoming unaffordable, and with energy supplies becoming ever greater risk of meeting world demand, not just U.S. demand. Is the complexity getting greater? Absolutely it is. Is technology getting more complex? Absolutely. Your smartphone has more embedded technology than the technology for information management used to put men on the moon in the 1970s. And you hold it in your hand. And so the amount of programming, the amount of software, and the use of that small micro technology driving towards nanotechnology is pretty complex to deal with. But it's continuing to become ever more technologically advantageous, but technologically more difficult to comprehend. And when you get into artificial intelligence, or you get into the advanced stages of information management, and then you realize there are criminals out there attacking us through cyberspace to undo what we've done with their own technologies, to invade our known technologies, and we can't hardly keep up with new technologies to protect ourselves from the invaders, we got serious problems coming right at us every day. Then we have demographics as destiny. The demographics of the nation, the demographics of the world are changing from what we knew in the 20th century. The 21st century has brought into reality different groups of people who are expanding their populations at different rates or shrinking their populations at different rates. Many European countries are practically at zero growth. Japan has been at zero growth. Demographics are destiny. Who's going to take care of the elderly in Japan when there are too few children to come along to replace them, which is where they're headed? And how will the ethnicity of the United States shift, and what implications do we have as the ethnicity shifts and we see other ethnic groups where some are shrinking, some are growing, and what are the implications on that, on the way in which we relate to one another in society? The issue of equity in the 21st century. Do not disadvantage me on an equity basis in the 21st century, I'll slap you down. Whether that's social equity, political equity, or economic equity, why should I be disadvantaged? Because of how I look? Because of where I was born? Because of what I've studied? Should I have equity disadvantage? Not in this day and age. Equity is everybody. Equity is everywhere. Equity should be equal in self-perception and in the realities of life. And where it's not, a price is paid to try to seek that equity which we all want. Connectivity is different in the 21st century. And finally, religion is different in the 21st century. Religion once was a time when religion was a private matter between you and your choice of how you practiced your religion, and it was very much a family or a personal matter. Now we have candidates running for office on the basis of their evangelism, on the basis of their religious beliefs, making sure everybody knows what their religious beliefs are. I personally have been challenged in Texas by many politicians that I try to talk to, or by other business people. What's first question I got asked in Houston, Texas, in a public session was, so which church do you belong to? I said, it's my private matter. I said, well, Come on, everybody knows what church people go to. It's none of their business. But it is public. And the way in which we broadcast it and communicate it, whatever religion it may be, is becoming ever more pronounced because we're defining ourselves in the 21st century by that religious affiliation. So these are some differences in the 21st century that nobody prepared our leaders for this. Leadership studies, from what I've seen and experienced around the country, don't come to grips with these issues in leadership studies except superficially. But getting down into the whys and wherefores of these dynamic changes in terms of providing the leadership we all deserve and the leadership I think we're entitled to is a matter for what are we going to do about it? So let me offer what I consider to be a solution, which is a new leadership framework that I call the coherent leader. The coherent leader takes advantage of everything we learned in the 20th century, doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater if the baby is well. Keep the baby. Don't lose the baby. It's precious. And that baby will grow into a great person. So keep what works from the 20th century and build on it. So this is not to dismiss or to diminish what we have learned in the 20th century. It's to update it, to upgrade it, and to make sure we understand it more fully in the 21st century so our leaders can help us. At some level, we're all followers, and we depend upon our leaders for the decisions. The whole of Kansas State University depends upon, in essence, the CEO of Kansas State University. I had tens of thousands of employees at Shell who wanted to know, what do I think? What am I doing? And that's the case. Americans want to know, what does the president think? We're very closely associated to the president of the United States in this country, whether we voted for him or not, because that person is the manifestation of who we are as a people. I would submit, and pardon me for my straight talk, we're building a 16-year hole in respect for the presidency based upon what we've seen in terms of executive leadership in this country for 4 straight terms. Because in my view, the people we chose didn't have the capacity, the capability, the experience, the knowledge, the awareness of what it took to be an executive in the 21st century, despite the popular vote. A 16-year hole means how long is it going to take to crawl out of it? And what's it going to take in terms of who we choose in the future to get us past this misery of structurally high unemployment, lack of economic growth, international chaos, and social dissent? Those are pretty big burdens to put on anyone's plate. And I don't demean for a moment the person of George W. Bush or the person of Barack Obama. They are well-meaning, well-intended public servants. But if you don't have the tools, you can't build the house. My argument is we need to make sure they have the tools or we don't choose them. So what are the tools? First tool, drawing on the 20th century, values and behaviors matter. If your values are not solid, if you don't believe in them, and your behaviors are not consistent with your values, say goodbye. You don't deserve to be a leader. That guy at AOL, yesterday's bad news story. How do you recover from having insulted your entire workforce by personifying the illness, the prematureness of 2 newborns as if somehow they demean the whole company by costing us money? He's done. Values and behaviors inconsistent with today's reality doesn't work, doesn't fit. Say goodbye. Don't waste your time rehabilitating. It's too late. That can apply to any leader in any occupation, in any institution, in any organization, in any company, or in any political party or office. Honesty, integrity, and respect for people. That's 3 values that deserve our attention in the leaders that we choose. Second, our leaders have got to understand context and have situational awareness that appreciates and absorbs the context. For example, George Bush didn't have a clue, in my opinion, as to the context of invading Iraq, or the awareness of the situation that would be created in that process, evidenced most emphatically by his helicopter arrival on a ship coming into port in San Diego, declaring victory when the fighting stopped, or at least the first round of fighting stopped. What utter nonsense, considering where we are today. Or Barack Obama not having a clue as to the context or the situational awareness of what happened when he walked away from the red line in Syria. Having promised not the nation but the world action against chemical weapons, to suddenly disappear with proof, valid proof of the use of chemical weapons. What that said to Assad, what that said to Putin, what that said to the Saudis, what that said to the Israelis, don't count on what he says. And not just the immediate effect, but the long-term effect. Says volumes about this presidential leadership. And I'm not trying to make this a political discussion. This is executive calls, executive decisions made in the managerial context of being the executive of the nation. So you have Bush and Obama making seriously flawed decisions based upon their lack of understanding the context or their inability to understand the awareness of the whole situation, at least as I see it. Third, depending upon the position you hold and the complexities and the ambiguities and the dilemmas and the dichotomies that you have to manage, you have got to have the cognitive complexity to handle what you've got to deal with. Cognitive complexity is more than intelligence. Cognitive complexity is the ability to think series and parallel across multiple fronts simultaneously and make judgments, good judgments. The cognitive complexity has to be at least equal to the task, and that's compounded by the ability to manage the time span of horizon at the same time. So it's one thing to have the cognitive complexity. It's another thing to have the time span of horizon. What do I mean by time span of horizon? Well, look at the time span of horizon of the basketball team last night. It was, how do we get out of this game with a win over the next 40 minutes? Well, it turned out to be 45 minutes, counting the overtime. They are focused in the moment, and you want them to focus in the moment. Do everything they can to successfully overcome the archenemy from up the road. Because don't we deserve to win? At least thrice in Bramlage Stadium. Yes, but it's only 3 wins. But the time span of horizon of the coach is quite different. Yes, the coach is focused on the game. Yes, the coach wants to walk away with a win. But the coach knows that he's got some seniors leaving. And the coach knows that he has some gaps in the bench. And the coach knows that he's got to not just think about next year and the following year, but where are we going to be 4 years from now when this whole team is gone? So the coach has a different time span of horizon. It's to look out over the longer term. It's like I described to the president. Schultz, he's got to think about 2040 and beyond. Now, not later, now. So you have to have this over-the-horizon radar, which can anticipate and understand the issues and the dynamics of the day so that you're prepared well before the time comes. That's time span of horizon and cognitive complexity, and that's how you get things done. You're able to make choices. You're able to develop relationships. You're able to record your achievements because you've thought it all through and now you've got a plan to get it done. Next, anyone who leads an organization has 5 obligations to their agenda for organizational leadership. These are the mechanics of leading and managing an organization. Whether you're the President of the United States, the Governor of the state of Kansas, whether you're the President of a university or the CEO of a company, or the head of any other association or institution from the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce, to the Planning Commission. If you're leading an organization, the 5 obligations you have to the people in that organization is, number one, you got to have a strategy. Where are you going? If you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. So you want to know where you're going. That's a strategy. You need a structure to make decisions, to know whose authority is what and who's working on what in the structure. So you need the hierarchy of structure in order to delegate duties so that work gets done, and you need a process of work. If you have to meet a payroll, you'd better have a payroll organization that knows how to track hours or weeks or salaries and pay the right amount. And you better have a process to do it on time, because if you ever missed a paycheck because the process didn't work and you're living paycheck to paycheck, you got a problem. So you need a process of work. If you need a process to put together a health care law, you're going to need a strategy, a structure, and a process to get the work done, which is what we didn't do. We didn't have a structure. We put Obamacare under the 3rd level of management at CMS, which handles Medicare. 3rd level of management at CMS is so low in the structure that when you run into a conflict, you can't resolve the conflict because you don't have enough authority. And then the process of work was largely delegated, farmed out to contractors, outside the control, the day-to-day management of senior leaders. And then where in the world was the cabinet secretary responsible for Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, invisible in the structure? And where was the president? Well, Kathleen Sebelius and the president, according to public records, met once in 2013 before the launch. So strategy, structure, process, people. You got to have people that know what they're doing. If you don't have people that know what they're doing, they're not going to get done what needs to get done. And finally, you have to have measures. So if you're the head of an organization, you better have those 5 capabilities nailed and understand what you're doing across all 5, because if you don't meet your measurements, you don't know what you've done. You don't know where you are. And when you're reporting to others what you are supposed to have done with no measures to report it, it's anybody's guess if you really did it. So I suspect we failed on all 5 fronts on Obamacare, which is a statement of executive capability, executive leadership. And people may not like me saying that, but hey, we're talking about leadership here. And we expect more. Somebody wants a big role, big title, they got to deliver. And I'm not politicizing this in turn. I'm a registered Democrat. It hurts me, pains me to see this failure play out in real time. Now, there are other redeeming qualities, so I'm not here to criticize and say you shouldn't be president, but I'm saying we got an executive problem with getting work done and holding the line. When you say a red line's a red line, it's a red line. If you have Bush completely misunderstanding other cultures, other countries, other histories, that's a serious problem. I'm not here to pick on them politically. I'm talking leadership. We deserve better, and the nation is suffering the consequence. Next is accepting the responsibility for the social impact of what you do. And within that, maintaining that sustainability matters. Because what else do we pass on to the next generation if we have not sustained the biosphere in their behalf? It's a very serious issue, especially for the next generation. Now, we have inherited from our parents and our grandparents a big mess. They may plead ignorance, they may argue that, well, they didn't know or they didn't have the technology or whatever, but we have a big mess on our hands to clean up. We have lots of remediation. We don't know what to do with our nuclear waste, but we have a lot of nuclear waste. What are we going to do about it? Is this generation going to fix the nuclear waste storage issue, or are we going to pass that over to you? Based on the current plan, you got it. This generation has written it off with a blue ribbon panel in 2010 that said we're going to stop Yucca Mountain, where for 20 years we built a storage site. We're not going to do it now because Harry Reid doesn't want Yucca Mountain to be filled with nuclear waste in Nevada. And we're going to go to a consensual, community-based storage system. That means if somebody proposes that Manhattan be the storage site for the nation's nuclear waste, you get to decide. You want nuclear waste in Manhattan, Riley County, Kansas? I mean, you got the military. Why don't you just take the nuclear waste at the same time and put them all together, right? I doubt you'll get consensus on that, either from the military or from the residents. But that's the plan, consensual agreement on storage of nuclear waste. Not going to happen. So over to you, folks. What are you going to do with our nuclear waste that comes from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, and this decade, and next decade? Get ready. So accountability for sustainability in today's leaders. The next is very personal. Leaders need, in this 21st century, to have the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, and the mental balance to do what needs to be done. The stresses are enormous, the tensions are great, the dilemmas and dichotomies are numerous, and so the individual must develop the maturity to balance their physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual selves in order to provide sustained leadership. And that's not an easy task. Where does the stamina come from? Where does the motivation come from? Where does the physical capacity come from? And we put a lot of leaders under stress. I mean, how'd you like to be the campaign manager for the Barack Obama campaign in 2012? You eat, sleep, and worry success. Or even more stressful, how'd you like to be the Mitt Romney campaign manager? Knowing that you're the underdog and somehow trying to overcome the disadvantage of the president's incumbency advantage. Pretty stressful occupation. But where is the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual balance in order to do that? And the second last item is also very personal. Can you master, can you manage, can you establish the flow, the personal flow in your life? If you think for a moment about what our athletes experienced in the final 2 minutes of the overtime last evening, I'll bet you each one of them thought, I can do this forever. I have boundless energy. I have perpetual stamina because we're going to beat these guys. We are sweating, we are hot, and we're good. And we're going to get it done. That's flow. Coming down the ski track in Sochi, that skier who is feeling at the top of his or her game, nothing's going to prevent them from challenging for the gold medal. They're in a moment of flow. Well, leaders have every bit as much importance in sustaining flow through their day because of the dependencies surrounding them and the importance of doing it right and doing it well, that they want and need that quality of flow that they can keep going, keep going, keep going. What does rest mean? What does food mean? What does sleep mean? I'm in the flow moment because it's necessary to do what I'm doing. And that is part of leadership in the 21st century where everything's coming at you in instant moments with the complexity surrounding, with all the other descriptors that I mentioned. And that gets you a title. You put these 7 qualities together, you get to earn a title. And that title is what I call the coherent leader. You have enabled yourself, or with the help of others, coaching, counseling, educating, you have arrived at a point where you understand each of the 7, you're up for it, you go for it, and you are determined with all your human fallacies, with all your weaknesses, with all your strengths, you're going to get there. Because what you know is that in the 21st century, the leader that will succeed, the leader that will take us from where we have been to where we want to be, that is the coherent leader. Wrapping it all up, creating a total package of leadership. It's not who's the smartest guy in the room. It's who can wrap it all up with this coherent appreciation, understanding, humility and grace of leadership. Not arrogance and greed, but humility and grace to take with all our faults and foibles as an individual, they wrap that package together, put a ribbon around it, and it is us. It is me. That's what the stakeholders deserve. The students of Kansas State University deserve nothing less than coherent leadership. The people of the United States deserve nothing less than coherent leadership. The citizens of Kansas, nothing less than coherent leadership. The employees of General Motors, the employees of Ford and Chrysler, the employees of Boeing, the employees of the local granary deserve nothing less than coherency in their leaders. And that's what gets the job of leadership done. And so my recommendation to leadership studies, to students of leadership, to those who want to be leaders, look at this holistically. Look at this comprehensively. Commit yourself to acquiring the knowledge, the skills, the capacity, the awareness of achieving that title of coherent leader. You'll love it. So will the people you're responsible for. So will the stakeholders of whatever you're doing appreciate you as a coherent leader. Thanks for listening.
How you doing? I'm Kay O'Neill, St. Louis, Missouri, Kansas State University, kinesiology major. And I would just like to know, what are some pivotal things you've done as a young adult that predicated your success today, or your current success?
Well, what led to my success today, or over the years, and I don't say this to patronize, but people in my life, my parents, my family, people like Lou Douglas, professors at the university, administrators in my time. I said to a class yesterday, one of the things I'll never forget is at K-State, as a student of K-State, is how hard I had to work to get the job done. Let me introduce my nephew, Mark Ronning. Mark, you working hard? You working hard?
I'm trying.
Did you make it to the basketball game last night?
I was studying.
And how many thousands just like you were studying, even though the field house was full? People were studying. That's what you do here. It's the knowledge that you're acquiring, the knowledge that you're creating, and the ability to take that knowledge and apply it. And that to me was my first stepping stone. Getting out of here with the degrees, getting into a company that saw perhaps promise in what I had to offer, and then 35 years of plugging away. 35 years of working through, and one thing I learned here in the political science department was to debate, argue, and come to agreement. What I brought to industry was that ability to bring people to the point of debate. Let's hear all the arguments, now let's agree on how we go forward. It's the agreement that matters. The debate is a process. The agreement is what takes you forward. I also worked for great companies that had tremendous education built into the way in which you manage your career. And the combination of all of that put together, I kept getting new and different responsibilities to the point that ultimately I was in charge of what I was in charge of and loved every minute of it. Not that it was necessarily simple or easy, and I never stopped working hard because that's the nature of work. But if you believe in what you're doing, it's not a pain, it's a joy. And you love it, and you want it because you're seeing the impact on others. And I go back to the lessons learned from Michael Suleiman, Lou Douglas, other professors I could name, and they all opened doors in my mind. And it was that which enabled me to, coming from Kansas State University, I was initially worried because I'm going to be working with peers who come out of Harvard, Yale, other major name institutions where Kansas State is Kansas who? You went to Kansas State? I thought that was a cow college. And there you are competing with these folks with their Ivy League educations and, from their elite high schools and so forth. And you say, I'm holding my own. That was pretty good education. And I sweated hard to get those pages done, or papers done, and doggone it, those professors back in those days didn't like 20-page papers. How could you possibly cover something in 20 pages? More like 40, 50 pages was the expectation. And that was before computers. But I think it really, getting the right start is what I'm saying. And I can't think of a better start than right here. And taking the fullness that's possible. Thanks for the question. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I want to sort of redress a couple of questions that relate to the fact that, in some sense, your call for leadership to make decisions is misplaced, especially local leadership. For example, the TV station which reports on the stock market international trends not long ago pointed out that the fastest growing manufacturing center in the world is located in Tijuana, Mexico. It has nothing to do with local leadership in Tijuana. It has to do with the fact that international financial interests have found that Tijuana is a good place that has large numbers of peasants who are illiterate and uneducated and can be brought into manufacturing mass industries and exploited very easily. It also has supplies of water, just as we have a situation where our senators, our governor, and lots of other people are arguing, and leadership in Congress are arguing for approval of the Keystone Pipeline. And why do people want the Keystone Pipeline to run through the United States down to near where you live in Houston? Well, why don't, if it's, it's such a good deal, why don't the Canadians refine the oil themselves and ship it? What has it got to do with the United States? Well, if you talk pipelines, of course, you immediately have to talk about the Kochs, because if you're talking pipelines, they control them. Keystone Pipeline, the biggest amount of money was for the steel to build it, which was done in Asia. And the reason the Canadians don't want to refine it is because they don't have the water. They want to use our water. And water is probably the resource that is most in danger of being outmoded in the next decades, as you pointed out. And also, when you refine that kind of tar sands oil, you have a residue of a type of coke that is unusable and has to be taken care of. In Detroit, they have a mound that's, 6 or 8 stories high of coke that was left from refining Canadian Keystone oil. But what I'm really trying to get at is that we're really ruled by fictions. There's a fiction that Kansas State is able to make decisions about the university. But really, it's the sports industry that runs the Kansas State rather than the other way around. So while faculty are being asked to have no raises or minimum raises or face cuts of positions, the sports industry somehow can reward its leaders with 25% or higher increases year by year. And it's also the only industry where if you fail and have to leave, you get money to pay, that pays for your leaving. Millions. Faculty don't get that. If faculty fail, they're tossed out, or they can be under certain circumstances.
Yeah. Do you want to get to a question?
What?
Do you want to get to a question?
Yeah.
So-
the question is, how do we really deal with the basic fictions in our society,
Yeah.
which are in our Constitution,
Right.
which
No,
have
it's-
elections when no one who works can get to elections, who have leaders who constantly restrict elections? We have a Secretary of State in Kansas now whose main job seems to be to make it impossible for more and more people to vote by restricting hours, restricting advanced voting systems. He wants the federal government to change its laws to deal with what Kansas deals with. Mm-hmm. We have a constitution that was built on the idea that gentlemen would be able to vote in their spare time because they didn't work.
Right.
So why do we have elections on Tuesday? Countries that have large participation have elections on weekends when people don't have to work. Right. And they have them on more than one day. Right. And they have long hours. And they have easy registration.
No, I think you make some very important points. And I realize that one way of describing difficult issues is to call them fictions. I call them anomalies. You could say anomalies and fictions are perhaps the same. We have, leaders are...
The Constitution doesn't mention parties. So therefore, right. Political parties are outside of the law.
Yeah, well, remember, the Constitution was written by an agricultural elite in a period of agricultural dominance. Sorry? And so what I'm trying to get to is leadership has a responsibility to all of its stakeholders to come to grips with the anomalies, the dilemmas, the uncomfortable issues that have to be dealt with. And we have often kicked the can down the road rather than deal with those anomalies and those issues. My argument is that's irresponsible, and we have to take hold of the issues we face. With respect to issues like the Keystone XL pipeline, there are fictions that are being perpetuated by those who are anti-pipeline. There are fictions being perpetuated by those who are pro-pipeline, and that's in the democratic discourse. Sorting through the fictions, as you call them, is a very important part of leadership's responsibility. And so whatever the right decision is for the pipeline will depend upon, in my opinion, the quality of the democratic discourse, getting to the facts of the matter, not the fictions of the matter. And the facts of the matter are, in that case, quite simple. Canada is going to produce the oil regardless of whether the U.S. wants it or not. So it's going to get produced. That's a sovereign decision of a country that has determined that exporting its natural resources is to the strategic good and the value to the population, and that's not going to stop, no matter what we do south of the 49th parallel. Whether the oil is refined in Canada versus refining it in Texas is an economic decision that has been analyzed by companies who refine oil, and they said, we're not going to build refineries in Alberta. We have all these refineries in Texas that are fully capable of taking that oil. I'm not going to spend another $3 billion to build a refining in Alberta when I have a $3 billion refinery in Texas that otherwise would be disadvantaged and wouldn't be needed if I built one in Canada. So it's an economic decision. The pipeline itself, whether it goes from Alberta to Victoria, through British Columbia, sorry, or to the East Coast to go to Europe, those pipelines will be built. The Americans have a choice if they want to play. We don't want to play? No problem to the Canadians. They've already said that. No hard feelings? We'll send the oil to Asia or to Europe because it's going to be bought.
But everyone knows that the pipeline is only being built in order to export oil to Asia.
No, sir. No, sir. No, that's not true. That's a fiction. I signed a contract with my name on it in 2007 to spend $7 billion in cooperation with Saudi Aramco to take Canadian oil sands oil into Port Arthur, Texas, at the Motiva refinery, in order to take advantage of the nature of the crude oil, in order to refine it in the United States.
But what were you going to do with that oil?
Sell it,
Where?
wherever.
So you're going to use a pipeline to send the tar oil all the way down to Texas,
Right.
and then use other pipelines to sell it other parts of the United States?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
you're paying double the amount for the same thing.
It's so inexpensive to ship product by pipeline compared to rail or truck that it's a savings.
Yeah, but the Canadians know very well that it would cost an untold amount of money to build a pipeline through Victoria. And the people of
Not
British
untold.
Victoria,
Not untold. You know exactly
of British
how much you're gonna
Columbia have
spend.
already said they don't want a pipeline
Some
there.
have.
They don't want it to spoil their waters.
Some have. We could have a long discussion about this, but there are many fictions perpetrated by both sides, and I think we have to get to the facts of the matter. And the facts are we're going to need the oil. The world's going to need the oil.
But how do you deal with the fictions in our constitutional system?
I can't fix those. Only the American people
Well,
can fix
leadership
those.
can't do it.
Leadership could do it if it was determined to do it, but
How
it has
can they
to be
do it when,
determined to do it.
in your own state of Texas, for many years, there was an attempt to provide education that, in effect, provided ignorance to the population.
Still is.
And throughout the world,
Sorry,
the
still
biggest
is.
problem is
Not
that most
once
of the
was,
new
still
Could I
is.
ask a question here? He's had quite a bit of time there. Yeah. I really enjoyed your discussion of the leadership of the presidents of the United States in the 21st century. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about leadership qualities of some of the presidents of the 20th century, the ones that you feel come closest to those 5 criteria that you talked about.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would put at the top of the list in the 20th century, in terms of coherent leader, Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower would be at the very top of my list, and I would also say that he had some of the toughest challenges of any president in the history of the country, coming out of World War II and going right directly into the Cold War and the nuclear threat. A recent biography of Dwight Eisenhower tells the story of how he, dealing with some of the strong-arm military types, forced his administration into a scenario analysis of what the world would look like in the face of nuclear war. And that's only recently been revealed through, the 50 years of classified secrecy. And what he forced his executive team to do in the White House with the Pentagon was to go through the impact of a nuclear war on the United States of America and what the consequences would be. And they laid it out in great detail. 100 million dead. This was when the country had less than 200 million people. 100 million dead. The entire region from Boston to south of Washington, unlivable for who knows how long. The migration of those who were still alive to the unindustrialized, undeveloped Midwest of the country, which in the 1950s was mainly an agricultural family farm type society, with survival rations essentially only available in certain regions because much of the food and water would be undrinkable and uneatable. So he took his top brass through that exercise for a particular purpose, which was to say to everyone, we can't have a nuclear war. Now that's just one example. But you go through example after example of what he learned through his military career, what he learned about leadership, what he did with leadership. And he wasn't perfect. Nobody is perfect. But the accomplishment was extraordinary. And I think in these later years, we're starting to really understand how significant his presidency was in the transition from hot war to cold war to no war, maybe one day. I think others, I rate LBJ pretty high. Not a nice person. To deal with LBJ, you knew who was in charge. But his coherency overall, he got incredible amounts done that young John Kennedy didn't know how to do. And he made the Kennedy agenda happen, which was a good agenda, but Kennedy didn't know how to do it. LBJ did, and he did it. I don't know enough to go back before Roosevelt, but I'd put Roosevelt next. So Ike, LBJ, Roosevelt. Roosevelt suffered from a lot of arrogance and, I think, self-appreciation. A legend in his own mind, and not very responsive to others' points of view, which got in the way of a larger agenda, in my opinion. Then I'd probably rate Ronald Reagan from the Roosevelt era on. Then probably Bill Clinton after Ronald Reagan.
What about Truman?
Truman, I'd really seriously discount. Yeah, I think he was overwhelmed. Very interesting man, but he didn't have the resume. I don't think he had the preparation, the sophistication. I mean, how can you integrate the Army or the military and leave the rest of society to fend for itself? Doesn't compute. And I think he was trying to make a point, but he didn't have the wherewithal to go beyond. And I think, to have the experience of World War II, and then the integration of the military, and leave society in an apartheid fashion, makes no sense. So I discount him significantly for his lack of social agenda, frankly. But that's my own ranking. You could have your own ranking. Yes, ma'am.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay. Thank you.
I really enjoyed everything that you spoke about tonight, especially when you were bringing up in terms of like sustainability, how important it is that we need to make decisions now that, are not going to adversely affect, future generations. And I really liked how you just brought up how Eisenhower looked into what nuclear war would cause to the American people. Now, there are a lot of climate models out there that show what climate change will mean for the world if oceans are just to rise 2 feet, which is what they're predicting, or 2 meters, 2 meters. And that's going to have a lot of environmental refugees, right? I mean, all of San Francisco, which is where I'm from, is going to be underwater. Manhattan, all of lower Manhattan is going to be gone. Not to mention India, Bangladesh, all these other areas, a lot of these islands too. But I don't really see enough I don't see enough action being taken to what are we going to do to try to mitigate these issues. I mean, we know that we're just letting all kinds of emissions go in the atmosphere. And yes, as Americans, we do have regulations here, and they are the best in the world. But we are still shipping our coal to China that's high in sulfur. We won't burn it here because it's way too high. And they're burning it there, and they don't have the same regulations. And the atmosphere knows no boundaries, okay? That particulate matter is getting onto the icebergs up in the Arctic and accelerating that melting. I mean, I just don't see enough action being happened. How can we make action happen? How can we have leaders who can actually make these decisions and it not just be, oh, well, climate change isn't real? Yes, it is. And we need to be aware of that. I mean, how do we change the system?
It's a serious leadership failure not to deal with it aggressively, with honesty, transparency, and recognition of practical reality. So you have today's reality, and you have tomorrow's energy. So how do we have a pathway? The fact that we are the world's largest economy, that we are the world's second largest polluter, we are the world's largest consumer of hydrocarbons, other than coal, which China leads the world in coal, but natural gas and oil, it's the US. We have no plan. No plan whatsoever.
We're producing that coal too.
And we're producing the coal. China, last week, EIA, Energy Information Agency of the Department of Energy, reported that today China's electricity generation is 79% coal, and they consume 50% of the world's coal. By 2034, 20 years from now, China will be producing electricity from coal at the rate of 55%, but they will double their coal consumption between now and then. Double it in 20 years. So from 50% of the world's consumption today, they will double that level of consumption by 2034, and there is nothing the U.S. can do about that. They will find
Stop
their...
selling to them.
Well, you can stop selling to them, but somebody else will. Because coal is a commodity. It's produced all over the world, and they will find their coal just like they will find their oil, just like they will find whatever they need to keep their economy going, because economic development is their top priority. But the world fails to come to grips with the issues at meetings like Rio, Copenhagen. Where was the last one? I think it was it Czechoslovakia? I can't remember exactly. But these are failures of leaders, gross failures, in my opinion. And the oil and gas industry is always present because it wants to be a participant in the outcomes of the decisions. I worked my butt off in 2007 and 2008 on a cap and trade bill for the United States of America as part of the United States Climate Action Partnership. I went to meetings I didn't have time to go to. I spent money I wasn't anticipating spending to try to create a legislative framework for Congress to deal with carbon pricing. We finally agreed, this was 30 companies, 5 environmental groups, and a few other hangers-on, very carefully selected to come up with an activist agenda for climate management through cap and trade on the basis that we could reduce and eliminate carbon pollution while not having a negative economic impact on society. We could structure it that way.
That was within our borders, though?
It was for the United States, yes. So it was called the Waxman-Markey Bill. By the time the Waxman-Markey Bill got out of committee, and by the time it was sent to the floor of the House for a vote under the Democratic leadership, it was called cap and tax. The Republicans called it cap and tax. Most of the 30 companies that were part of the framework walked away from it because it had been so twisted and distributed unevenly by special interest money lobbying the committee that took our framework and changed it into a bill, that virtually all the companies said, we can't support this. This is not what we designed. This is so punitive because it gave coal a free ride for 25 years. Coal did not pay a penny in having to purchase credits for 25 years. That was to get votes from coal states to pass the bill. All the penalties went to gas and oil, aluminum, steel manufacturing, which said, wait a minute, this is not going to be fair when we pay all the bills and coal creates all the carbon, or the bulk of the carbon. So we backed away from it. It passed the House with 7 votes. 7 votes, with a Democratic majority of about 35 votes at the time, which means a lot of Democrats voted against the bill too. So it went to the Senate wouldn't touch it. I saw Congressman Markey, who I like a lot, he's now a senator, and I said, well, Congressman, I guess we better go to Plan B. He said, there is no Plan B. I said, I know. So we're nowhere. The White House in the 2012 presidential campaign said no carbon tax. The White House will not get behind the carbon tax because they don't think it makes sense to tax Americans when the rest of the world is not on board.
But I think that would make us a great leader, is showing that leadership. I mean, look at CVS, right? They said they're not going to be, they want to be a pharmacy provider,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And
So
they're not going to sell cigarettes anymore. I think
Right.
that's great. Why
Yeah.
can't we have more of that kind of leadership?
Exactly, because we don't have the model of coherent leader that balances all these things simultaneously. Leaders have to take risks.
Yeah.
And if they're unwilling to take risks, you get what you get, which is not good enough. And so in terms of intergenerational sustainability, I think the more we talk about it, the more important it becomes. But we're not doing the job today. The leaders we have elected, the corporate leaders we have installed, the institutional leaders who are part of the society's fabric at the elite level, they're not talking about this. They're not going to do anything. And I think that's problematic. Leaders lead with the risks understood. And if the political career trumps leadership, then what you have is a political hack, using terminology that most politicians resent. But you have a political hack who places politics above what's right. And the only way to hold that person accountable, or the whole lot of them, you're not going to do it with democracy in name only. You're going to do it with informed citizens activating their citizenship. That's the solution for the problem you're describing. Informed citizens activating their citizenship and reminding the politicians who works for who. We often forget who works for who. With all the trappings of office, with all the power of the private aircraft, and with all of the perquisites of leading a committee of the Senate or a committee of the House and the staff that you're assigned, that is creating this mystical notion, talk about fictions, this mystical notion of power. And what's better than power? Well, maybe money, but there's a huge debate. What's better, power or money? Can one command the other? And that's without active citizens dealing with this. And I learned activism right here on this campus. And that was between 69 and 73 during the Vietnam era. And when the shootings at Kent State took place, this campus didn't quite shut down, but it came close. A bunch of us went up to KU to shut down KU. And KU shut down. We wanted our degrees. Let KU struggle with that. But I and a bunch of others drove up to KU and voted to shut down the university while we kept KU State open. But we had our protest movement, and President McCain endorsed our protest as long as it was nonviolent. And we tried to assure him it would be nonviolent. And the only thing that happened is one of the caskets caught fire during the march. But we just set it aside and let it burn. But nothing else caught fire. So it was relatively peaceful. And so I think that what we have what we need are leaders who take risks and citizens who hold them to account. Thanks for your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
There will be books for sale in the back, and John will be available for a few minutes to sign books.